Sometimes the most important changes in the Church do not begin with a decree, a speech, or a crowd gathered beneath the windows of the Vatican. They begin with something far more human. A name remembered, a door quietly opened, a man once pushed to the margins suddenly being asked to step forward again. And for Catholics who have spent years wondering whether Rome still hears their concerns, those small gestures can carry more weight than 100 official statements. Because when trust has been wounded, people do not first look for promises. They look for signs. And in the opening months of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate, one of those signs began to emerge in a place few were watching, and through a relationship almost no one expected to matter this much. For 4 months, Catholics across 11 countries, part of a global church of some 260 million watching closely, had searched every gesture of the new pontificate for meaning. Then, with no press conference, no dramatic announcement, and almost no warning, Pope Leo XIV made a choice involving Cardinal Robert Sarah that caught nearly everyone off guard. Curial insiders had not predicted it. Traditional Catholics, who had spent years hoping Sarah might again receive a visible role, had not expected it, and by most accounts, Sarah himself was not waiting for such a summons. The signal did not come from the balcony of St. Peter's or through some sweeping Vatican declaration. It came through an appointment connected to a centuries-old shrine on the Atlantic edge of France. That is where this story begins, not beneath Michelangelo's ceiling, but at Sainte-Anne-d'Auray in Brittany, where pilgrims have knelt for 4 centuries in memory of the apparitions associated with Ivan Nicolazic, the Breton farmer who said he encountered a luminous figure and was called to restore what had been lost. 400 years later, Leo XIV selected one man to stand there in his name. That man was Robert Sarah. The choice carried weight, far beyond ceremonial protocol. Sarah was born in Guinea, raised in poverty, shaped by persecution, prayer, and a faith tested long before he entered the Roman Curia. He served as prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship under Pope Francis, before leaving that office for the quieter life of a prefect emeritus. To many Catholics, especially those attached to older liturgical traditions, he became something larger than a former Vatican official. In the months between the death of Francis and the election of Leo XIV, many prayed for him, not because they expected him to become pope, but because they feared what he represented might slowly disappear from the Church's public life. Then came Leo XIV, elected on the 4th ballot of the May 2025 conclave, the Chicago-born Augustinian, whose ministry had been deeply formed in Peru, made a remarkably deliberate choice. He looked toward the ancient feast of Saint Anne, toward a shrine bound to 4 centuries of Breton Catholic memory, and chose Sarah as his representative. From Brittany to Buenos Aires, especially in traditional Latin Mass communities, Catholics immediately understood that the gesture would be watched closely. The appointment came on May 24, 2025, for the 400th anniversary of the apparitions of Saint Anne in the Diocese of Vannes. Sainte-Anne-d'Auray is not simply another French basilica. For generations, it has been described locally as the spiritual heart of Breton Catholicism, a place where pilgrimage, procession, Marian devotion, and regional identity grew together. On July 25th and 26th, thousands of young Catholics, many between 16 and 30, would gather there for the Grand Pardon, sometimes described as a Breton World Youth Day. They would come for worship, concerts, talks, friendship, and something harder to manufacture, the experience of young people choosing a faith they had not merely inherited. Leo XIV entrusted Sarah with leading the liturgical celebrations. On Saturday, July 26th, at 10:30 in the morning, the Cardinal would celebrate a pontifical Mass inside the Basilica before Catholics from France and beyond. For many observers, the first reaction was silence. Then came surprise, and for some, unmistakable joy. The reason was simple. The Vatican had no shortage of active prefects, dicastery heads, or senior churchmen who could have represented the Pope. Yet Leo XIII chose an 80-year-old Cardinal Emeritus, whom many Catholics regarded as living in a kind of dignified ecclesial distance. Special papal missions of this visibility do not typically go to retired cardinals. By choosing Sarah, Leo reached beyond the obvious names of the active curia, and placed public trust in a man whose voice many believed Rome had allowed to fade. Nothing had been formally reversed, no decree had been issued, no old battle had suddenly been settled. But Catholics know that Rome sometimes speaks before it explains, and this time the message was carried by a man. To understand why that mattered, we have to step back and ask a more important question. Not merely what office Robert Sarah once held, but who Robert Sarah had become in the Catholic imagination. Robert Sarah was born on June 15, 1945, in Urus, a small village in the Republic of Guinea. His family was poor. His country, after independence, fell to a Marxist dictatorship that openly persecuted the church. Sarah survived it. He was trained in Rome, ordained a priest, consecrated a bishop, and eventually became Archbishop of Conakry. A man who had lived through totalitarianism, who had watched his diocese suffer, and who emerged from it not embittered, but clarified. His faith, forged in fire, had a particular quality to it, which those who knew him described as the stillness of someone who has learned to distinguish between noise and truth. Pope John Paul II brought him to Rome. Pope Benedict XVI made him a cardinal. Pope Francis appointed him prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship in 2014. And for 6 years, Sarah became the most recognizable voice in the global church, calling for what he called the sacred silence of liturgy, for reverence, for what he named the reform of the reform. He wrote books that sold in hundreds of thousands of copies. He gave interviews that circulated in every language. He became, for a certain portion of global Catholicism, not merely a cardinal, but something closer to a teacher. And then came Traditionis Custodes, the motu proprio issued by Pope Francis in July 2021 that severely restricted the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of centuries, the Mass of saints and martyrs and ordinary faithful who had never known anything else. The document was a turning point. Supporters of the old rite were shaken. Cardinal Sarah, who had long defended the ancient liturgy, who had argued that a rite celebrated for over 1,000 years could not simply be legislated away by administrative decree, was, within months, replaced as prefect of divine worship. He became prefect emeritus. He was 80 years old by the time Leo XIV was elected. The question that hung over the beginning of the new pontificate was a simple one, though its implications were vast. What would Leo XIV do about the traditional Latin Mass? About Traditionis Custodes? About the communities of faithful who had grown up with the ancient rite and felt that their form of worship had been treated not as a treasure, but as a problem to be managed? And what would he do about Robert Sarah? The first signs came gradually, quietly, the way genuine shifts in the church often do. There was no dramatic reversal, no press conference, no formal abrogation of Traditionis Custodes. What there was instead was a series of gestures, each one small by itself, each one unmistakable in context. The first clear signal had come with Sarah's appointment as special envoy to Saint-Andoré. Then, on September 22, 2025, came something more personal. For the first time since Leo XIV's election in May, Cardinal Robert Sarah was received privately at the Apostolic Palace. The Vatican press office confirmed the audience as usual, but disclosed nothing about the conversation. Matteo Bruni simply said the exchange was private. Still, the meeting itself mattered. For the first time, the new pope was sitting face-to-face with a cardinal who, for many Catholics, represented unresolved questions about liturgy, tradition, continuity, and the direction of the new pontificate. Sarah had already spoken publicly 10 days earlier. In a September 12th interview with the Italian bishop's newspaper Avvenire, he said he was looking toward Leo XIV with great confidence. He praised what he called the Pope's restoration of the indispensable centrality of Christ and Leo's evangelical awareness. The conviction that without the Lord, nothing is truly possible, not peace, not the church, not the salvation of souls. Those did not sound like the words of a man disappearing into retirement. They sounded like the reflections of someone watching carefully, perhaps beginning to believe that convictions he had defended for decades might once again receive a hearing. Then Leo XIII turned toward France. On March 20th, 2026, the French bishops were preparing for their spring plenary assembly in Lourdes, the city of Bernadette, apparitions, pilgrimage, and healing. Among the questions before them was the growing tension surrounding the liturgy and Catholics attached to the traditional Latin Mass. In some dioceses, they had been welcomed pastorally. In others, many felt they were treated more like a problem to manage than members of the same church. Leo sent a letter through Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State. Its language immediately drew attention. The Pope described the liturgical division as a painful wound within the Church, and urged the bishops to seek concrete solutions. Then came the phrase that traveled far beyond Lourdes. He prayed for a generous inclusion of those sincerely attached to the ancient rite, in respect for the directions of the Second Vatican Council. Generous inclusion, not reluctant tolerance, not bureaucratic containment, generous inclusion. For Catholics accustomed to reading every Vatican phrase carefully, those words carried real weight. Sarah was listening. By June 29, 2026, at the close of the Second Extraordinary Consistory of Leo XIV's pontificate, on the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, he said publicly what many had already begun to wonder. What was written to the French bishops, Sarah said, must apply to all bishops, not France alone. He urged bishops of the Roman Rite to be more open, more fatherly, and to stop creating unnecessary division. Then he went further. Sarah raised a theological question. Could any pope simply suppress a rite celebrated for more than 600 years? His language remained careful, but the argument was unmistakable. If an ancient rite has helped shape Catholic theology and worship across centuries, could access to that source simply be prohibited? He pointed directly to St. Augustine, the theologian at the heart of the Augustinian tradition that had formed Leo XIII himself. If a rite is a source for theology, Sarah argued, forbidding access to it would be like preventing Christians from studying Augustine when reflecting on grace or the Trinity. He was no longer speaking only about France. He was speaking to the entire Church. And what made the moment different was that Sarah was speaking within a pontificate that had already given him room. Leo XIII had chosen him as an envoy, received him privately, and used the language of generous inclusion on the very question Sarah had defended for years. The Pope had not formally endorsed everything Sarah believed, but Sarah was no longer speaking from the margins. He had been given ground to stand on, and there is one moment that explains this relationship more clearly than any Vatican document or interview. It did not happen inside the Apostolic Palace, before cameras, or during a consistory. It happened months earlier, on July 26, 2025, at Saint-Anne-d'Auray. Cardinal Robert Sarah, 80 years old, the son of a poor family in Guinea, trained in Rome, shaped by persecution and silence and prayer, walked in procession into the ancient basilica in Brittany. He vested for a pontifical mass. He stood before thousands of young Catholics, 16, 17, 18, 20 years old, who had come from across the Diocese of Vannes for what was called, with some affection, the Breton World Youth Day. And he celebrated Mass. Not a mass of committees and commissions, not a mass of debates and documents, a mass, the ancient act, the act that Robert Sarah had spent his entire life defending, not as a matter of liturgical taste, but as the living heart of the Church's encounter with God. Pope Leo XIV was not present. He was in Rome, but his envoy was there, his chosen representative. And the faithful who filled that basilica and lined the streets outside understood something that no press release could have communicated, that the new pope did not consider the traditionalist faithful of France or of anywhere to be a problem to be solved. He considered them to be a family to be accompanied, and he had sent the man they most trusted to accompany them. A young woman from the Diocese of Vannes, interviewed afterward, was asked what it meant to see Cardinal Sarah there, sent personally by the Pope. She paused for a moment, and then she said only, "We did not think anyone remembered us." That sentence carries a weight that any analysis of curial politics cannot quite touch. Because beneath all the theological debates, beneath the questions of motu proprios and liturgical directives and episcopal permissions, beneath all of it, there was a human reality. There were communities of faithful, often small, sometimes isolated, frequently misunderstood, who had felt in the years of traditionis custodes that their attachment to an ancient form of worship had made them suspect in the eyes of their own church, who had felt not merely regulated, but marginalized, who had read the 2021 document not as a pastoral correction, but as a verdict. Cardinal Sarah had never stopped speaking on their behalf. In his September 2025 interview with Avenir, he had said that a rite, by its nature, is not composed at a desk. It is the fruit of theological and cultural stratification and sedimentation, centuries of prayer, of lived faith, of saints and scholars, and ordinary believers who had knelt in the same posture before the same mystery. He said he considered the variety of rites in the Catholic world to be a great treasure. He said that over the centuries, this diversity had never posed a problem for authorities, because the unity of faith was clear. And he had said one more thing quietly, in a passage that received less attention than it deserved. He had expressed reservations about the practice of one pope canceling what had been established by another. The Church, he said, is continuity, not the continuity of bureaucracy, the continuity of faith. One pope should not simply say the opposite of another, not because popes are infallible in their administrative decisions, but because the Church is not a government that changes policy with each election. It is a body that moves through history as a single living thing, receiving and transmitting what it has been given. This was in some ways the deepest question embedded in the relationship between Leo XIV and Cardinal Sarah. Not merely what will happen to the traditional Latin Mass, but what kind of church does Pope Leo XIV intend to lead? One that treats its ancient inheritance as something to be legislated and managed, or one that holds that inheritance with the kind of reverence Sarah had been calling for across decades. The answers so far have not come in the form of dramatic reversals. They have come in the form of appointments and letters and private audiences. They have come in the form of a pope who, in an interview before his election, had said something that none of his colleagues had thought to say publicly, that perhaps the abuse of the Vatican II Mass, celebrated poorly and without reverence, had driven some faithful toward the older form, not because the older form was superior, but because what they were seeking was an encounter with mystery, and that if the newer Mass were celebrated with the dignity it deserved, the difference between the two experiences might not be what the polemicists claimed. Leo XIII had, before he was pope, described the polarization around the liturgy with the kind of plain-spoken sorrow that suggested he had watched it as a pastor, not as a politician. He had not, as pope, resolved it with a single document, but he had done something that some thought equally significant. He had sent Robert Sarah to Brittany. He had received Robert Sarah in a private audience. He had written to the bishops of France, asking them to be generous. And in July 2026, Cardinal Sarah, standing before journalists at the close of the Second Extraordinary Consistory, had declared that what Leo XIV had asked of France must apply to the entire world. But before reaching that moment, before the Consistory of June 2026, before the letter to France, before any of the careful gestures that have defined this relationship, there is one more thread that needs to be drawn out. Because the relationship between Leo XIV and Robert Sarah is not only a relationship about liturgy. It is a relationship between two men whose entire lives were shaped by the encounter between faith and power, and who arrived at the same conclusion from very different directions. Robert Sarah grew up under Sékou Touré. The name is not widely remembered outside Africa, but it should be. Touré was the first president of independent Guinea, a Marxist dictator, who ruled from 1958 until his death in 1984, and who spent much of that time dismantling the institutions of civil society, including the Church. Sarah was ordained in that environment. He was formed as a priest and bishop in a country where faith was treated by the state as a form of subversion, where religious communities were harassed, where the faithful gathered in the knowledge that what they were doing was in the eyes of the government an act of defiance. Sarah did not merely endure those years in Guinea. He came out of them with something harder to acquire than education or ecclesiastical experience, a tested conviction about what the church actually is. For him, the church could never be reduced to a social institution wearing sacred language. It was not a cultural refuge, a humanitarian organization, or a community structure designed to make people feel spiritually comfortable. It was, first and before everything else, the body of Christ moving through history, carrying human beings toward an encounter with the living God. From that perspective, everything else fell into its proper place. Synods mattered, documents mattered, liturgical directives mattered, curial appointments mattered. But none of them could become the center. If the church ceased to lead people toward Christ, then all the machinery surrounding it, however impressive, would become secondary noise. Sarah did not learn that in an academic seminar. He learned it by living through Guinea. Decades later, on another continent, Leo XIV encountered a different version of the same truth. When the young Augustinian priest from Chicago arrived in Chulucanas in the 1980s, Peru was not an abstract missionary assignment. He entered communities marked by poverty, dust, instability, and limited institutional support. There were places where Catholic life survived, not because there were abundant resources, but because ordinary people refused to let their faith disappear. He remained in Peru for years and eventually became Bishop of Chiclayo. Along the way, he encountered a Catholicism that was intensely human, Marian, popular, traditional, sometimes rough around the edges, but deeply woven into family and community life. And he paid attention. He did not approach that faith as something primitive that needed to be corrected into modern respectability. He saw what hardship had taught those people. Faith becomes different when it is no longer decorative. When people have little else to hold on to, they become remarkably clear about what can be surrendered and what cannot. That was something Robert Serra understood from Guinea. Leo understood it from Peru. Two men, formed thousands of miles apart, had discovered a similar reality. Christianity looks different when it cannot depend upon social prestige, political protection, comfortable institutions, or cultural approval. That helps explain something important about Leo XIV's relationship with Sarah. When the Pope looked at the Guinean Cardinal, he was not simply looking at a retired Vatican official with strong opinions about the liturgy. He was looking at another churchman whose faith had been tested outside the comfortable center of Catholic power. Both had learned that the Church's first responsibility is not to make God acceptable, fashionable, or easily managed. It is to make his presence real. Seen in that light, Sainte-Anne d'Auray becomes more than an appointment. It becomes recognition. The September 2025 private audience becomes more than ceremonial courtesy as well. It was a meeting between two men formed in radically different worlds, who nevertheless understood something similar about the difference between what is essential and what is merely institutional. And during the opening months of Leo XIV's pontificate, they appeared to be discovering how much common ground existed between them. That did not mean every disputed question had suddenly disappeared. Traditionis Custodes, most notably, remained formally unresolved. But in June 2026, Cardinal Sarah offered an interpretation that was arguably more interesting than simply demanding that the document be abolished. Rather than insisting that one papal act must immediately be overturned by another, Sarah suggested that perhaps the life of the Church could move in a different direction, even without a dramatic legal confrontation. Perhaps, he said, even without a formal repeal, the restrictive text could disappear little by little, day by day, year by year. His proposal was gradual. Pastoral openness could return. Bishops could become more generous. Communities could be allowed room to breathe again. What had been tightened administratively could slowly lose its force through a different pastoral practice. "Let it fade," Sarah said. "Leave it and say, 'Continue.' And this text will disappear little by little." Coming from Sarah, that was significant. For years, he had openly defended greater freedom for the ancient rite. Yet here he was not demanding an immediate decree from Leo XIV. He was describing something more organic. A tension inside the church, being healed not through one authority publicly humiliating another, but through repeated acts of pastoral generosity until the atmosphere itself changed. There was something distinctly Catholic about that approach. The Church has lived for centuries, and not every conflict has been settled by one document defeating another document. Sometimes change comes through practice, patience, bishops choosing mercy over suspicion, and relationships slowly accomplishing what legislation cannot. That may be the deeper story developing between Leo XIV and Robert Sarah. Their relationship has not been built through dramatic announcements. It has been expressed through gestures. Whom does the Pope send to represent him at an ancient French shrine? Whom does he welcome into a private audience? What words does he choose when speaking to bishops about Catholics who feel pushed aside? Generous inclusion, rather than reluctant accommodation. Those details matter because Leo XIV himself was formed inside the Augustinian tradition, with St. Augustine's vision of the restless human heart searching for peace in God at its center. His motto, in illo uno unum, in the one we are one, suggests unity without demanding sameness. Ancient and modern, Latin and vernacular, Africa and America, tradition and renewal can remain distinct without becoming enemies, because their deepest unity does not come from administrative uniformity. It comes from Christ. Sarah arrived at that same center through a very different road. Poverty shaped him. Persecution hardened his clarity. Dictatorship taught him how quickly institutions can become fragile. His faith survived because it was not merely theoretical, and that experience shaped his understanding of worship. For Sarah, liturgy should never become entertainment or spiritual comfort designed to make Christians feel perfectly at home in the surrounding culture. Worship exists to turn the human person toward God, to remind believers that their final home is not the world as it presently exists, but the God who transcends it. That distinction can sound severe until one remembers the life behind it. Sarah did not develop those convictions in comfort. He carried them out of Guinea. Leo carried his own pastoral instincts out of Peru. So, when an American Augustinian became Bishop of Rome and an 80-year-old Guinean Cardinal remained one of Catholicism's most recognizable voices for liturgical tradition, something unexpected began to happen. They found a language in which they could hear one another. It was not yet the language of sweeping decrees or spectacular reversals. It was quieter than that. An appointment, an audience, carefully chosen words, and space given to a voice many assumed had already been pushed to the edge. What was being built was not necessarily an alliance. It was something more human, and perhaps more durable. Trust. There was a moment in Cardinal Sarah's June 2026 interview, at the close of the extraordinary consistory, that received less attention than it might have. He was asked about synodality, the concept that had shaped much of the later Francis pontificate, the vision of a church that moves forward through listening and discernment and widespread consultation. And Sarah said plainly that it was a term he had never understood. He was not dismissing consultation. He was questioning the concept as it had been deployed, the suggestion that the Church's future lies in processes of dialogue that sometimes seem to float free of the doctrinal and moral certainties that give the Church its identity. He contrasted communion and synodality. Communion, he said, is the end. Synodality is a means to be verified. Communion is hierarchical because that is how Christ wanted his Church to be. Synodality, and here he cited Leo XIV himself, is more of a style, a manner of proceeding, not a destination. He then said something about the study group report on homosexuality, that such a document should not reach the world's dioceses without the personal scrutiny of the Pope himself. He said that what has been done for 1,600 years cannot simply be declared no longer valid. He said that the Church of 2050 will still be a light in the world, not because of any human strategy or institutional reform, but because the church does not belong to men. Not to the bishops, not even to the Pope. It belongs to Christ. These are not the words of a man who has been defeated or silenced. They are the words of a man who at 80 years old has found a new context in which to speak. A pontificate that has not perhaps given him everything he might have hoped for, but that has given him something more valuable than a formal victory. It has given him a hearing. The story of Pope Leo XIII and Cardinal Robert Sarah is still being written. No climax has yet arrived. Traditionis Custodes remains on the books. The traditional Latin mass communities of the world continue to watch and wait. The extraordinary consistory of June 2026 took place against a backdrop of ongoing theological and pastoral conversations that will shape the Church for decades. Cardinal Sarah is 80 years old, and the arc of his influence is entering its final chapter. But what has been established in the months since May 2025 is something quieter and perhaps more durable than a formal document. It is a relationship of respect, a relationship in which the new Pope looked at the calendar of the Church's life, looked at the anniversary of an ancient apparition, and said, "Send Robert Sarah," in which the new Pope, months into his pontificate, opened the doors of the Apostolic Palace for a first private conversation, in which the new Pope, in a letter to the bishops of France, reached for the word generous rather than the word permitted, the word inclusion rather than the word accommodation. Cardinal Sarah, in his June 2026 interview, said something that has stayed with those who heard it. He was speaking about the liturgy, about the ancient rite, about what he called the theological and cultural sedimentation of centuries of prayer. And he said, "A rite is not composed at a desk. It grows in the life of the faithful. It is sanctified by generations of those who knelt before it in faith and love and need. It cannot be made to disappear by administrative action any more than a river can be made to stop flowing by a decree. The water finds its way." Perhaps that is the deepest thing to be said about what Pope Leo XIV has done with Cardinal Robert Sarah, and what Cardinal Sarah has done with the opening that Leo has given him. The water is finding its way, slowly, in the language of gestures and appointments and carefully chosen words, slowly, in the manner of a church that moves through centuries rather than through news cycles, slowly, with the kind of patience that faith makes possible. In the end, Cardinal Sarah has returned again and again to one conviction: the Church belongs to none of us. Not to the curial officials who argue over its documents, not to commentators who interpret every appointment, not to the cardinals who advise the Pope, not even, in the deepest theological sense, to the Pope himself. It belongs to Christ. And for Sarah, that changes everything. Institutions can hesitate, policies can shift, generations can misunderstand one another. But what has truly been entrusted to Christ is not abandoned simply because a particular moment in history becomes uncertain. That is why the image at the center of this story is so striking: an ancient liturgy, a cardinal from Guinea, an American Augustinian seated on the chair of Peter, a basilica on the coast of Brittany, where Catholics have prayed for 4 centuries. And between them, one quiet papal decision, one man sending another to stand in his place before the faithful on the feast of an ancient saint. For those who had spent years watching closely, it sounded like the first faint note of hope. Not victory, not resolution. Hope. And hope in the Church is rarely tidy. It does not erase every tension or answer, every theological question overnight. It does not remove every fear carried by Catholics who wonder what may happen next. But even incomplete hope changes the way people endure uncertainty. At Sainte-Anne-d'Auray, that lesson is older than any modern Vatican debate. For roughly 400 years, pilgrims have prayed there in Breton, a language that outlived political regimes, cultural pressures, and repeated predictions of its disappearance. Each summer, they still come to kneel at the shrine, associated with Saint Anne, honored in Catholic tradition as the Mother of Mary, and therefore the grandmother of Christ. Generations changed. Governments changed. The prayer remained. People kept arriving because faith survives differently from institutions. It does not live only through decrees or official permission. It lives because ordinary men and women continue believing, often quietly, that God is real and that prayer is more than inherited ceremony. It is an encounter, a conversation, sometimes even an act of endurance. Leo XIII sent Robert Serra into that history. He sent him not merely to attend a commemoration, but to preside over worship in a place where memory, suffering, identity, and faith had been woven together for centuries. The gesture barely resembled the dramatic turning point that headlines usually demand. There was no sweeping declaration, no great reversal announced from Rome, only an appointment letter, an old basilica, thousands of believers, and a mass. Yet for Catholics who had feared that certain voices, traditions, and memories were slowly being forgotten, something seemed to have been acknowledged again. Not restored completely, not settled permanently, but recognized. And perhaps that is how genuine restoration often begins in the Church, not with thunder, but with someone remembering what others assumed had been forgotten. A pope chooses a cardinal. A cardinal walks into his ancient shrine. The people pray as their ancestors prayed, and what looked obstructed begins quietly to move again, like water finding its path.